Okay, yeah, we have a very brief outline of our presentation today. We will first talk very briefly about the background of the research, how the study was first designed, and then we will share the details of the study, and then finally our findings and our conclusions. Actually, this was the result, the product of an international collaboration between 3 different countries and 4 different universities. The project partners were just, as you see, Gazi University, Boğaziçi, University of Avra, and Pomeranian University, but the study itself was conducted in Turkey, Portugal, and Poland. The aim was to establish international research groups, and this is one of the end results of this collaboration. So in what context did this study emerge? Very easily, definitely, we can say that English has a global role as an international language in our day. And consequently, it is becoming even more important to reflect this role of English in classroom practices, especially in English language learning contexts. So it is crucial to develop a critical sense of the complexities inherent in the teaching of such a global language as English. So when it comes to reflect this kind of an awareness of the role of English as an international language, there emerged some important issues regarding the classroom implications, such as mutual intelligibility and the appropriate use of language, the presence of cross-cultural and cross-linguistic elements regarding the use of local background, cultures, and languages, as well as the international language, and the existence of different language varieties and local cultures in the classroom. So, of course, when implementing this kind of a multiple background and culture, it might be quite difficult to predict exact situations in which these could interact. So the solution could be to develop a widespread understanding of culture. So we just wanted to see what in-service English language teachers would think about some of these important issues through a questionnaire study. So, the questionnaire itself was implemented between January and March last year in 2018. It was delivered to in-service English language teachers in Poland, Turkey, and Portugal, a total of 159 English language teachers. And the topics of the items that they responded to were around cultural awareness, language awareness, instructional awareness, native and non-native speaker interactions, as well as non-native speaker interactions. The teachers responded to these items in the form of Likert scales, ranging between strongly agree and strongly disagree. Before we moved on to interpreting the results of the items, of the responses, actually, we first wanted to do some quantitative checks of the questionnaire itself. So we conducted an exploratory factor analysis, and we came up with a 3-factor model. Within this 3-factor model, we had these 3 constructs emerging from the items. One was cultural awareness, and the other was positioning native varieties and native speakers. And the last one was awareness of communication goals. We named these actually constructs depending on the content of the items that clustered around different factors. The overall variance that was explained by this 3-factor model was around 43%, which is at quite a moderately acceptable range. And the internal consistency of the overall questionnaire was around 0.73, which is also quite an acceptable internal consistency value.
Thank you, Elifcan. Hello, everyone. Welcome all. It's Yavuz here. After Elifcan, I will refer to some findings of our survey study of, within the ILTERC project. But since we have a lot of items on the questionnaire, and given that we have limited time here, we thought that it would be wise to present some examples and general impression from the findings rather than trying to cover all of the items. But for those who are interested in the full-scale study, you can find this in the latest issue of Eurasian Journal of Applied Linguistics. So the example items, we had two items that investigated whether the views of our respondent teachers, whether they think native English-speaking teachers and non-native English-speaking teachers should speak English with a British or American accent in two separate statements. And as you can see, although the percentage of teachers who were kind of neutral to these two propositions, there were more teachers who agreed that native English-speaking teachers should have an American and British accent, and there were more teachers on the right down who think that non-native English-speaking teachers do not need to have a British or American accent. Well, traditionally, as you know, British and American accents are regarded as high, prestigious accents. And the models used in ELT classrooms are usually American and British models. But here what we see is a little bit different, right? There is a diversity of ideas here. Although there are certain tendencies, there is also strong opposition, right? So this might be showing us that things might be changing regarding the views regarding the position of native speakers and native varieties of English. Another example says that native English-speaking teachers' job is to teach students how to communicate in English. Well, in that case, not surprisingly, there is a obvious tendency to agree with that proposition. A solid 84% of the respondents agreed with that statement. There were few teachers who disagreed, and some 10% were undecided. Well, this might not seem very interesting on its own, but when you look at the next statement, you can make the connection, right? Non-native English-speaking teachers must rely on native speaker models to communicate successfully in English. Well, in that case, you see that most of the teachers tend to agree with that statement. Although there is a strong opposition, it is not as strong as those who agreed that native variety should be the model, native speakers should be the model for non-native English-speaking teachers. But also notice that there are still considerable number of teachers who were undecided about this issue. Well, the next example is about culture. It investigated whether it is essential for our respondents to teach the students similarities and differences between the native English-speaking countries and their own country. In that case, most of the teachers agreed to that statement, majority of them agreed to that statement, showing that yes, the differences between the local culture and the native cultures should be made explicit, should be emphasized in the classroom. Again, regarding the culture, we had a strong statement that said students do not need to know about the cultures of native speakers of English to communicate successfully in English. Well, in that case, most of the teachers disagreed with that, which implies that they said, no, students need to know about the cultures of native speakers of English to communicate successfully. So they kind of attached this great deal of importance to the cultures of native speakers in language teaching. Well, final example we have here, again, is related to culture. It investigated whether general subjects, neutral subjects such as technology, science, geography, should be the focus of language teaching rather than cultural elements. It kind of investigated the place of culture in language teaching. And again, not surprisingly, most of the teachers did not agree with that statement and said that culture should be an element in language teaching practices. But here again, I want to draw your attention to the number of teachers who had no idea, who did not opt for any option, who were undecided about this topic. So to summarize what we have, first of all, teachers from these three different contexts, Turkey, Portugal, and Poland, seem to, they think that native English language teachers play a key role in getting students to communicate successfully in English. And they think that non-native English teachers should follow a native speaker model for successful communication, right? But on the other hand, they think that non-native English speaking teachers do not need to sound like American, do not need to sound like British. Regarding culture, we saw that the teachers see cultural elements in language teaching as something important, as something central, as opposed to or in addition to neutral subjects. But they also think that native speaker cultures play a key role in language teaching to make students competent in English, right? And they also think that the differences between local culture and the target culture, native speaker culture, is something important. It should be highlighted. It should be emphasized in the classroom. Well, what kind of implications and conclusions we can draw from these findings? Well, first of all, I think that the first thing to accept is that an understanding of English as an international language or English as a lingua franca is making its place in ELT. This is kind of evident because, as we saw, on one hand, teachers seem to still value native speaker varieties and native speaker models on one hand, but on the other, they also think that non-native English teachers do not need to sound like, do not need to imitate native speaker teachers. And on one hand, again, they value the cultures of native speakers, but on the other hand, they do not totally ignore the importance of local culture. And this was, I think, also evident when we look at the numbers of teachers who were undecided about the topic, who did not have a kind of certain idea. This kind of shows that they need orientation. So depending on that, we think that teachers should be actively involved in discussions about ELF. They need to develop, they need support to develop an awareness of English as a lingua franca, to be able to bring ELF-aware practices into their classrooms or to be able to prepare materials with an ELF mindset. And acknowledging the diversity of language use and users is a big aspect of this. The use and users, the diversity of use and users as it is in the real world. Also, the teachers can also bring examples of successful communication interactions between non-native speakers or people from different cultural backgrounds. This will also foster the sensitivity and respect to different cultures and different L1 backgrounds in the classroom. And finally, there is, the teachers also should develop ELF-based activities and materials that promote greater intercultural awareness. This is something important because I think that ELT materials most of the time fail to respond to this need. In a very recent study we conducted ourselves, we analyzed some textbooks from Turkey and Portugal that were widely used and published by local publishers and international publishers. And it turned out that those books really failed to respond to this diversity of language and diversity of cultures. They kind of did not represent the real face of the language. They were highly dominated by British and American varieties and the cultures associated with these countries. Well, thank you for listening. That's the end of our presentation.